Thank you, Premier. I'm not sure I have a great deal to add in terms of the epidemiology either. It is good to see 3 consecutive days in double figures. Wednesday's maintaining its reputation as a bit of a spike day, so an increase of cases since yesterday, but there has been more testing as well. Again, we want to see the cases that are out there, and people really should come forward for testing so that we can identify anyone who does have coronavirus and follow up their close contacts. But there's absolutely a stabilisation in numbers. We're seeing only 3 or 4 new cases in the whole of regional Victoria on a daily basis now. And that's why the active cases are coming down so significantly, because there are really very few new cases arising in those local government areas. The same in aged care. There's absolutely a stabilisation of the active outbreaks. There's still a number that haven't been closed off. It does take a period of time before we would declare an individual facility as having closed its outbreak. It does need to go through an entire incubation period of 14 days. But we're not seeing so many new cases in aged care. We're certainly not seeing new outbreaks in aged care, and so the number of active cases in aged care has been coming down by 100 or so each day. Similarly, in acute health settings, there's stabilisation in the number of active healthcare worker cases, and the number of new healthcare worker cases has dropped below 10. So I think 5 yesterday, 6 today, with some under investigation. And equally in disability services, not seeing new cases there. We're seeing active cases who are recovering, and therefore a gradual drop in the number of active cases, mostly amongst staff rather than residents in those settings. Overall, only a few new outbreaks each day, and the burden of our cases are really in 25 or so local government areas. So there is a concentration that remains in the north and west, but also in Casey in the southeast. There's diminished activity in a lot of local government areas, especially in regional Victoria, which is how we want it to be and how we want to keep it.
Can I just ask about, you weren't in favour really a few weeks ago of testing people who don't have symptoms. Have you given any thought to, in some way, a controlled testing of people who don't have symptoms to keep the test numbers up?
We have done that to a degree. So there are some high-risk settings, some high-risk industries where there's been more proactive testing of asymptomatic individuals. It remains very low yield. So you have to do thousands and thousands of tests to find a case. We should really focus our efforts on making sure that more than 50% of people who have symptoms who aren't getting tested are coming forward for testing. That's still got to be our priority, because some of those symptomatic individuals will have coronavirus. They're not showing up in our numbers because they're not coming forward for testing.
How do you know that what's that 50%?
We are doing surveys, regular surveys of people who have coronavirus compatible symptoms, and we're asking them if they've gone and gotten tested. That's also part of national flu surveillance, where people reporting online that they have compatible flu symptoms, which are really the same as coronavirus symptoms, and whether they've gotten a test for coronavirus. And for people who have more severe illness with fever, it's above 50% for people who are getting a test for coronavirus. But for people who have very mild symptoms, just that scratchy throat or runny nose or very slight cough, it's below 50%. So we know that we want 100% of people with compatible symptoms to be tested.
That's over time. That's not just one moment in time.
No, that's over time. That's a regular snapshot that's being done.
And hay fever. If you get hay fever, do you go and get a test? Because I know what hay fever feels like. It's not a cold. Do I need a test?
Look, there'll be some people where it's an itchy nose for a short time in the morning, a couple of sneezes. I get something like that. Totally resolves after minutes. And then there's no ongoing symptoms. There's no cough, there's no fever, there's no headache, there's no fatigue. That doesn't require testing. But for people who have ongoing symptoms, even if they might think it's their hay fever, if they're compatible symptoms with coronavirus, we would ask them to get tested, because if they're developing coronavirus, they will have those symptoms, and it'll be hard to tease out for the individual.
Professor Sutton, if I could just ask, our third day in double digits, but the number is obviously 20 higher than yesterday. When you saw that figure, were you happy with that kind of being in line with where your game plan is at the moment?
Oh, I guess it's in line with expectations. I'm never happy with a number that's higher than zero, but it is to be expected. We have had more people coming forward for testing. I do think that there are going to be 100 plus actual cases out there each day at the moment. We want to find all of them, so it is important that we increase those testing numbers, and we'll have days when we find more people. That's okay, but it is broadly in line with what modelling has suggested we'd be at this stage.
And I know you can't have a yardstick or predicting, and it's hard when we ask you what numbers we need each day, but if we're seeing it more, where is a number at the moment that would raise your concerns around whether we're going to be on track to do whatever the plan is that's happening on Sunday?
Certainly if the 7-day trend, the 5-day trend isn't decreasing over the next week, that would imply to me that we're not on track. But if it continues down, and it doesn't have to be huge drops, if it continues down, then we're heading in the right direction. We can certainly make those considerations that we're already talking through.
How much testing have you put on the number of active cases that we have in the community right now? Because I feel like we often look at the daily number and we hinge our hopes on that, but how much of opening up is dependent on those actual active cases, the ones we've seen from past days?
Yeah, active cases are not quite as much of a concern. They're obviously known cases. They're in isolation at home. They're admitted patients in hospital, or they're being looked after in aged care, so they're contained in that sense. But if there are, as there are currently, 2,500, there's always the potential that they're going to infect close family members if they're isolating at home, if they haven't taken up an offer to isolate elsewhere. So there's always that ongoing risk of transmission, having another generation of cases. So it is important that we see that continue to drop. But they are known factors, and they are controlled. We know where they are. They're being looked after to be isolated.
Do you worry about engaging with them as restrictions ease? Obviously, as restrictions ease, there's that temptation to go out with more freedom. How do you engage with those people and make sure they are isolating? Well,
certainly there's the daily check-in that's happening. That will continue for every active case, no matter how many we have. Operation Vestige, where people are getting the door knock and being checked on for their isolation or quarantine, is going to continue. And so I think we will absolutely continue to engage them. And I think for people who know that they've got coronavirus, or who know that they're a close contact, even as we lift restrictions, they'll understand that their obligations are absolutely to be isolated or quarantined wherever they are, and we'll be checking on them.
Do you know what percentage of people are testing positive from the testing, even as these testing numbers are dropping, and how that's changed, and if that's significant?
Overall, it's about 1%, but there are local government areas where it's closer to 2% or above 2%. So we know those hotspot areas are going to have higher percentages. The proportion who are testing positive. We focus our testing in those areas. It has come down over time in recent weeks as case numbers have dropped, but that's not universally the case. Casey, for example, has probably seen an increase in the proportion testing positive. And again, there's a push to get testing done there, because I think not enough people are testing in the southeast compared to the northwest.
Do you support a national definition of a COVID-19 hotspot, and should that definition be used to determine who can travel to which state?
I think it would be great if we can get there. It's a really vexed issue, and in many respects it's not an issue that's front of mind for me in Victoria, because it's an issue for other states to define where there's areas of current transmission. So, if you're a jurisdiction with no active cases or only cases in hotel quarantine and no community transmission, then your issue is about how you define hotspots in other jurisdictions. So it would be great if we could get to that. I think it would, potentially make for an easier movement of people across the country, but it is it's a pretty vexed issue. Every jurisdiction is going to come to its own threshold.
And is the difficulty in working out what that definition should be? And I guess what principles would you use in working out what the threshold should be?
It is difficult in some ways. What's the objective of naming a hotspot? If it's for trying to have some freedom of movement across the country, that's one thing. But if it's defining how you would apply a quarantine requirement for people coming from those hotspots, or indeed an absolute ban on people coming from those hotspots into your jurisdiction. And as I say, every jurisdiction will have its own risk threshold in that regard, and it's really for them to make the call on it and to try and come to a common view if they can.
Have there been discussions at AHPPC about that, and do you expect that to be on the agenda in coming meetings?
It has been discussed. It's going to National Cabinet as a point of discussion.
I wanted to pick up an earlier point that you made. You said asymptomatic testing of people in high-risk zones has yielded a low result. What does low actually mean?
1 out of thousands of tests being taken. So if someone's a close contact, we test them in outbreak settings. So in a meatworks, in an aged care facility, if there's a single case in a resident or a staff member, we're testing everyone regardless of symptoms. So they're higher yield, but that's a different circumstance, a different setting where we're doing close contact testing essentially. But for the general population, even in high risk settings, it's hundreds to thousands of tests that need to be done to pick up someone.
And where are we getting most of our positive cases, particularly over the last few weeks as case numbers have come down?
We're still seeing it in those areas of the usual suspects, Wyndham, Brimbank, Hume, local government areas. But some smaller postcodes pop up within those local government areas with some clustering of cases. So that changes over time, but it's remained in the north and west. But as I say, Dandenong, Casey local government area has been more of a concern in recent days.
And is it mostly healthcare and aged care still?
Not universally, certainly healthcare to a degree with the Peninsula Hospital cases. Aged care, often in those postcode hotspots, it's because of the active cases in aged care, but there's also community cases that are often linked to workplaces and their households, their close contacts in households.
So can I just clarify that a large majority of our transmission is still in workplaces and then like family transmissions?
It's still aged care, healthcare, workplaces, high-risk workplaces, other workplaces, and then close contacts of known cases.
And just the mystery, forgive me, I just can't
talk.
Mystery cases, do you have any sense, I know this is the hardest question because you have to investigate, but this week, out of those numbers, the 70s and the 90s, how many of them are mystery cases or community transmission?
We're still seeing around 15% as a proportion of our daily totals as mystery cases. For today's numbers, I can't tell you because they will be closed off in the next 48 hours probably. But looking back over the week, it's clear that it's still sitting at around 10 or 15%. So we're getting to single figures for mystery cases. We do want to get it down as low as possible, and we'd be very happy if we see none at all.
So what's the tolerable, because you said yesterday you'd like no mystery cases. Is liking mystery cases, liking to have none, is that the same as what we have to have before we ease things?
I don't know that it's going to be an absolute condition, but we do need to have very low numbers in order to lift in certain areas in certain ways, for sure.
And what's tolerable? Because I looked at New South Wales, I think they had something like 22 in the month of August, so almost one a day. So they can endure one mystery case a day, say. Is that a tolerable level, a level that we could open up?
I don't know that we've landed that yet. It does depend where they're occurring. If they're all clustered towards the end of the month, it's not about a daily average. If you suddenly get a significant number that you can't track down in a short period of time.
And has
mystery
has
cases,
your...
sorry, when we entered stage 4 lockdown, there were 760 mystery cases. There's now 4,351. How is it in just over a month that we've seen so many mystery cases?
So they're the ones that have been closed off through the investigations of all of those historical cases. The proportion of our daily totals that have been mystery cases was early on, late June, at about 15%. It rose above 25%. It's come back down to 15%. So those 4,000 are of all of the cases that we've had right through, and a lot of them have been closed off in recent weeks, but they're not recent mystery cases.
So was it possible when we entered stage 4 there wasn't 760 mystery cases? It was actually over 1,000?
Yeah, we would have had more that hadn't been closed off in terms of the full investigation. They would have still been classified as under investigation until you can go through that very detailed step of understanding that they have no close contacts, they have no links to other cases.
Seeing as there is 4,351 mystery cases, just how confident are you that we can get down to hardly any?
Well, I think we can get there. You know, if we can get cases below 30 and the proportion of mystery cases is, continues to be driven down, then we'll absolutely be in very low single figures, and we will do that more detailed investigation, upstream investigation that I've talked about, where you're actually looking at everyone they've been in contact with, not just when they're infectious, but in the 14 days before they became symptomatic. So that's acquisition testing. You're looking at all of the people they've been in close contact with where they might have gotten that infection from. So it's not just doing the history and the interview to try and find that out, but it's testing all of those people, including with blood tests, serology tests, not just the PCR swab at the back of the throat, to determine whether they might have been the original case. And if you can understand that, then you can explore their close contacts and where that chain of transmission might be occurring.
And so does that include asymptomatic testing in those cases as well? Is that where you see a role potentially in the future?
Yeah, for acquisition testing, for that upstream testing, where many people have likely recovered already and therefore won't have symptoms anymore, you might want to be doing the PCR testing to see if the virus is still around, or that serology testing where it shows that someone has been infected but is no longer infectious.
Professor Sutton, I'm just a bit confused with the numbers. So it's possible that we had far more than 760 mystery cases when it was announced on stage 4 lockdown. We're now getting different numbers with deaths every day. So this is the third day in a row that we're now seeing deaths reported that actually occurred some time ago outside this 24-hour period. Is that something we should just expect from now on? Just more deaths, I suppose, popping up that actually occurred some time ago?
Well, as I've said in the last couple of days, there are reporting delays from some facilities. They've got new mandatory arrangements where they have to report to the Commonwealth. They're catching up in their reporting to DHHS, and so there will be some that come through in coming days. But I don't think anyone's too confused by the fact that we can say, here are the deaths that have occurred in the last 24 hours, and there's another number that are historic deaths, but are otherwise not in today's numbers.
Why is it that it's only 3 days ago that we all of a sudden had to catch up with these reporting?
Well, that's when the reports have come in from those facilities. I can't speak to when they've collated them and when they've made a decision and gone through the process of reporting them. We obviously would love to hear them now and have that absolute confirmation with the Commonwealth's numbers.
I suppose I'm just, how confident can Victorians be that these are the right numbers, that this is our death toll and this is the accurate number of mystery cases, if it was possible that it was far more than what we were told a month ago?
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that really. These are the numbers that are reported to us every day. They're accurate with the information that we receive. The same with our mystery cases. They are not resolved on the day that we get the notification of a positive result. They're resolved in the days that we investigate them. So they'll be closed off at a different point in time.
Your reports in regional settings.
Sorry, Samaya.
Sorry, thank you. I just wanted to ask about modelling. Our case numbers are on track with what your modelling has suggested. What about the mystery cases? Is that 10 to 15%, I guess, yeah, is that on track with what modelling suggests?
You can't model mystery cases, so they'll be part of that total number within the modelling, but it'd be great to be able to separately model them, but they're not part of that, the ability to model for them.
We're hearing reports that in some regional centres, testing facilities are scaling back and even closing. Are you familiar with that, and is that sending the right message to regional communities?
I'm not familiar with it. I would hope that the accessibility of testing remains very broad across Victoria. We know that even if there are local government areas with no cases now, that was the case 6 weeks ago before we went into this wave in full. And we know that people need to be able to access testing to be able to find those cases. So even if there's no active cases in our local government area, it doesn't mean that it can't be seeded from Metro Melbourne, from another area where there are cases. So I'd hope that there's always access to a testing site. I can understand scaling back if they don't need the staff because the number of people coming forward for testing isn't as great, but I think the access needs to be there right through.
So even if there's no new cases or anything, they can scale back, that's fine, but they really need to remain open?
Yeah, I would absolutely advocate for the accessibility of testing sites across the state.
Further to that, the government's established 6 new COVID regional response units. Apparently the nearest one to Mildura is at Bendigo Health. From your point of view, should the North West have its own, notwithstanding the lack of active cases there at the moment?
I think it's working really well in terms of how the regional units are operating, and they're having those discussions with the rather vast areas in their regions. I haven't heard from them that they feel that there's a need to devolve again out to the far northwest. But if there is, I think it could be explored. But they've certainly worked very well in terms of understanding the local issues, addressing the cases very promptly within their regions, and having the established community relationships and organisational relationships that's helped them really respond very robustly for those regional cases.
Can I ask you about the curfew? Do you see an ongoing role for a curfew in any way? And is it possible, looking back, that you can tease out what role it has played?
It's a little bit difficult to know exactly what it's done. We know that clearly it's reduced mobility in those hours. I think it makes it easier from a compliance point of view to find people who are breaking curfew and are not travelling for legitimate reasons, and they're people who are unnecessarily putting others at risk. Obviously, if you're going to work, if you're going out for another essential reason, the curfew doesn't apply. You can move, but I think it's made it easier from a monitoring point of view for police to be able to find people who are breaking curfew, and they are potentially putting others at risk. So I think it's useful in that regard. As to how long it'll be needed for, they're still under consideration.
And can I ask to establish why there's been an increase in cases in the Casey and South East area? Is it predominantly linked to the outbreak at Frankston Hospital? Or?
No, I think there's always been some transmission in the South East. The numbers have picked up with aged care outbreaks, with the Peninsula Health outbreak, but there are also workplaces that continue to drive transmission in the South East, and they're not dissimilar to the workplaces where we've seen high risk cases previously. So I think that's part of it.
Can I just ask it to clarify? Are you considering curfews of any sort into the future, or do you think that that's done?
Well, as we've said all along, everything's on the table. Nothing's off the table. It'll be a consideration to continue, but we'll look at what role it's played in fuller detail this week.
And just to follow up to yesterday, you said that you didn't know about a man who was on a plane to Brisbane and who apparently had tested positive. Have you found out any more information about that?
So there's nothing else to say in that regard. There was no infectious individual on a flight to Queensland.
So anyone who had previously tested, that's not something that would obviously come to the attention of authorities then?
So we wouldn't name an individual as with all our notifiable diseases, but there's nothing to follow up in terms of Queensland needing to take action for close contacts or contacts on a flight.
Do you think that we'll all be wearing masks mandatory at Christmas time or in the next few months?
Look, Christmas time is a billion years away at the moment, but
do you see any end in sight in the next month or couple of months, or it's just?
I think we'll see masks for the next month in one form or another. As I've mentioned before, it may not be all settings at all times, but masks have made a difference. Masks continue to make a difference across the world, and there's increasing evidence of their use and their usefulness, and there's not much of a downside. I know that some people find them uncomfortable. It's an inconvenience, but in the grand picture, they are a small thing to introduce at a pretty low cost. I think there was a financial study in the US that suggested their true value is about $58 for what they prevent in terms of their healthcare costs of coronavirus in that jurisdiction. So it's a pretty useful intervention.
And can you just clarify in what way you think masks work? Because it seemed to me the science was it stops me giving someone the virus but doesn't stop me getting it. So what's making a mask work?
It's a bit of both. I think it's most useful for those who have coronavirus to be wearing a mask in terms of reducing that risk. And it's perhaps particularly useful because of the infectiousness in the day or two before you develop symptoms. And so for those individuals who won't be on guard, who won't be isolating necessarily, who'll be out and about for essential reasons, that they reduce the risk of transmission to others. But even for the recipient, even for the uninfected person, you've got less of a chance of breathing it in through your nose or mouth. It doesn't protect the eyes, so it's not a guarantee, but it is that additional level of protection.
Do you know if the mask and the curfew, I mean, does that change people's behaviour away from the curfew? Am I more cautious? Is the population more cautious because they're wearing a mask and they know they've got to be home by 8? It
is hard to tease out the direct and indirect benefits. I think there's already been evidence that wearing masks makes people distance from you more, so there's a double benefit there. And I think it was pretty clear that we were going through an enormously challenging time in our second wave, and making masks mandatory had that direct usefulness in reducing transmission, but it was absolutely a signal that everyone needed to do something here, and that everyone needed to take this seriously, and that the risk of transmission was amongst all of us across the state. So I think it had that additional signal.
There's been recent research that suggests bandanas and scarves, for example, aren't as effective as surgical masks and these masks. Professor Brendan Crabb wrote about it in a newspaper yesterday about advising against the wearing of masks, scarves, bandanas and face shields. Do you have any comments?
Yeah, I think we've always said that the recommended mask, cloth reusable mask, is a 3-ply mask, and we've given some instructions on how it can be made or the things to consider in wearing a mask, and that it's ideally better than a single-ply mask, ideally better than a face shield. It is better than a bandana or a scarf in that regard. When we made it mandatory, we were absolutely conscious of the fact that most people would need to have 3 or 4 masks at home with their families, and for themselves. You don't just use one, you might need 2 or 3, and so we didn't want to have a significant impost on people. But again, it's for consideration. We do understand that there are greater benefits with a 3-ply mask, and so I would still make that recommendation. Whether we move to saying, scarves or bandanas shouldn't be used at all, I think we'll keep that under consideration.
And a face shield's useless if you don't.
No, they're not useless. They give some protection, but again, they sit here, they protect your eyes, but less so your mouth. And if you're not wearing a mask with a face shields are used in hospitals to protect the eyes and to give some additional protection, but they're always worn with masks. They're not worn on their own.
Are you still actively considering some options for single people, sort of any sort of bubble they might be able to pursue?
Yeah, we are. We recognise how hard it is. I know people have made the comparison to New Zealand and the policy settings that they had. They were in a different time, and it was less challenging in terms of the numbers that they were dealing with. We've had to do very, very strict things in Victoria to get on top of our much more substantial community transmission, but we recognise the enormous personal costs that some of this stuff brings.
Just got a question for the Premier, if I can. I'm being a bit cheeky here because I'm actually asking these on behalf.
One of the things that we did after getting out of stage 3 was increase, for example, the number of visitors you can have in your home from 5 to 20 virtually overnight. Do you think that contributed to the quick transmission of coronavirus inside the community?
I think in retrospect, there was household transmission that was absolutely driving some transmission in the early stages of our second wave. We didn't know what was ahead of us at that time. We have always been cautious, and we've been steady in many respects, this virus finds its way, and you can just be unlucky in some regards as to where it finds that gap or pathway through. And you know, we can't have regrets about what's happened. We absolutely have to learn from everything that's occurred, and to make sure that we're addressing every single one of those gaps to the fullest extent that we can.
And what have we learned from easing out of stage 3 and then out of stage 2?
Oh, I could write a book on what we've learned coming out of this stage and coming out of the first wave. I think it's exactly that. It's that the virus will find a way, if there is any vulnerability, if there is any missed area that hasn't been considered about how it could transmit and how it could take off. And so you have to think of every single unreached community member. You have to think of every single weakness in workplaces, every single infrastructural, operational process element in all of those settings where transmission can occur more readily. I think that's what we've gone through. It'll be an ongoing battle, but yeah, so very many lessons.
And how confident are you? I know it's probably going to be impossible to think about 100% of things, but how confident are you that we've been able to think about, 99.9% of little details?
Yeah, look, I think people around the world are still getting surprised by this. I don't know that we'll get to 99.9%, but it's not through lack of looking, and it's not through lack of trying. But we, we'll get it through that respectful engagement with people with contrary views, with fresh ideas and new approaches, and I'm open to that.
Are you going to write a book?
Are you a ghostwriter?
I would just say, that's entirely a matter for Professor Sutton. I would just say that